Thank you all for coming. I'd like to ask everyone to get their food and drink and come please take a seat because we're going to be starting our program momentarily. Also, I'd like to remind everyone to turn off their cell phones. Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Nina Shea, and I direct the Center for Religious Freedom of the Hudson Institute. And the center is comprised of myself and Dr. Paul Marshall over there. We have been at Hudson for 3 years, but the center has been working on issues of religious freedom in Washington since 1986. And it is my pleasure to welcome back today Dr. Mark Dury, who comes all the way from Melbourne, Australia, to be with us. He was here a little over a year ago discussing a religious vilification case in Australia. This is a case that has really preoccupied Paul and I, as we have written about this in our forthcoming book, Silence, that will be out later this year. Dr. Dury is a theologian, a human rights activist, and a pastor of an Anglican church. He has published many books and articles on the language and culture of the Achenese. In fact, he is the author of the first book on grammar of the Aceh language and an Aceh dictionary. He is also one of the youngest ever who has been elected a fellow of the Australian Academy of Humanities, which occurred in 1992. And he writes and speaks frequently on interfaith relations. In 2010, he published a book, Third Choices, about religious minorities under Islam, and that book is available for purchase in the back of the room today. Today, Dr. Dury will be addressing the organization of the Islamic Conference and its fatwas on freedom and democracy. The OIC, as it's called, is not well known in the United States, but it is best thought of, I guess, as the UN of Muslim states. It uses the concept of the UN and gives it a religious purpose. Since the administration of George W. Bush, the U.S. has had an envoy to the OIC and has observer status there. So I'd like to, at this point, ask you to join me in welcoming Dr. Dury to the podium. Thank you. We will have, after Dr. Dury's presentation, we will have time for question and answers, and at that time I ask you to identify yourselves before asking questions. And we are being filmed, which will be broadcast both on our website and on, I believe it's VOA.
Thank you, Nina, for that introduction. It's really a delight, a pleasure to be here. I'm a great admirer of the work of the Hudson Institute in many areas, but particularly its work of advocacy and analysis in the area of religious freedom. And they've made a huge difference, I believe, and will continue to do so. The organization of the Islamic Conference was founded in 1969, and its constitution explains that it is, in effect, a political expression of the concept of the ummah, or nation. This is a theological construct in Islam. A particular verse in the Quran is often cited in connection with the role of the ummah. You, that is Muslims, are the best nation, that is the word ummah in Arabic, brought out for mankind, commanding what's righteous and forbidding what is wrong. Today, I think there should be a PowerPoint. I wonder if we could get some technical help to get the projector working.
we had it working just a second.
Oh, here we go. So from Surah 3, chapter 110 of the Quran, you have the verse which defines, in a sense, the mission statement of the Ummah, the nation of Muslims. Today there are 57 member states. Quite a number of them don't have a majority of Muslims, but they all have at least some Muslims in them, and most of them do have a majority of Muslims. The organization is based in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. It is an organization, so it has different manifestations or expressions of its structure. There is the Islamic Summit, which is the heads of states, which meets 3 yearly, the Islamic Conference of Foreign Ministers, which meets annually, a permanent secretariat, various standing committees, and a set of subsidiary organs that are supported and funded through the OIC, a number of centres of research, development bodies. There are also universities, and the Islamic Fiqh Academy, which is what I'll be focusing on today. The OIC is an organisation with a global focus. They seek to promote solidarity and cooperation amongst Muslim states in multiple different areas, culture, politics, education, health and trade. They are also working according to their constitution for economic integration, that is to establish an Islamic common market, as they describe it. They are there to promote the common interests of Muslims in the world, not only in OIC member states, but everywhere, and or the interests of the Ummah, the Islamic nation. And also one of their functions is to promote and defend the true image of Islam. So it has very much a religious function in addition to political, cultural and other educational roles. And as Nina mentioned, the United States has an envoy to the OIC. Now, human rights has been a focus of the OIC. They're very active in the United Nations, where they have been criticised. It has been claimed that the OIC at times has acted as a bloc to protect member states from criticism, and also that criticism of non-Islamic states for treatment of Muslims is sometimes a theme of OIC members, but not of member states for the treatment of Muslims or of non-Muslims. A very significant product of the OIC was the Cairo Declaration of Human Rights in Islam, which was produced in 1990. The Cairo Declaration, modelled in some ways on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, offers guidance for member states. It is very interesting for its statement that the Sharia really is the sole determiner of everything in human rights. So the Sharia is the path, the right path of Islam. It says the only source for human rights, and that all rights are subject to the Sharia. Islam, it says, is the guarantee for enhancing human dignity. And just to give you an example of one of the clauses in the Cairo Declaration, life and bodily safety is protected as a human right, except as allowed by the Sharia. So if there are areas in Islamic law that say that it's possible to take someone's life under certain circumstances or apply penalties on someone's body, then that is not protected. There's no guarantee in this Cairo Declaration of freedom of religion, but only a prohibition of the use of coercive means. And the Cairo Declaration has been criticised by human rights experts for some of these characteristics. In the Cairo Declaration, freedom of expression is discussed at some length. It's subject to Sharia norms. That is, it says a right to promote what is good and speak against what is bad. That's a reference to that verse in the Quran which defines the mission of the Muslim nation. And speech must not undermine or weaken Islam. So there's freedom of speech, but not if Islam itself is impugned by that speech. That is not protected. Nor if that speech is against what the religion of Islam values. So it is very much a statement that supports a conservative understanding of the role of Sharia in determining the pathway for human beings to walk on. I'd like to move now to the Islamic Fiqh Academy, Fiqh Jurisprudence. It was established in 1981, funded, supported by the OIC. It's a subsidiary organ of the OIC, so it's one of those organisations that is under the OIC. At the moment, it has experts from 43 of the 57 member states, so not from every state. All its business is conducted in Arabic. Its website is based in Saudi Arabia, and it is all in Arabic. And the OIC has 3 languages, Arabic, French, and English, but the Fiqh Academy is very much an Arabic-only affair, based in Jeddah, and I've given you the link there, fiqhacademy.org.sa. The Fiqh Academy has met 19 times in 19 sessions, and also has had 15 symposiums to date. So they've been very active since 1981. Their goals are paralleling those of the OIC to unite the Ummah, the nation of Islam, by conforming conduct to the norms of Islam at all levels. So that their goal is to work towards a true Islamic conduct in accordance with the principles of Islam at every possible level, in the global sphere. And also specifically to apply Islam to contemporary problems. There's an awareness that many issues are arising for Muslims all around the world in a rapidly changing technological environment and also shifting political environment. And the function of the Fiqh Academy is to provide advice or guidance, which is a central value of Islam, to provide guidance for how to live in the modern world. It is aiming to create a body of Islamic jurisprudence to meet the needs of modern life and to equip the Muslim world for living in the modern world. The main areas of work, in fact, the bulk of its resolutions are concerned with Islamic finance and economics. So securitization, interest, loans. Interestingly, many of the members of the Fiqh Academy are top-level consultants to international banks and financial agencies. They would be advising on Sharia finance. And they would be referring to the work of the Fiqh Academy, which has done so much work in this area over the last 30 years. They also work quite regularly on issues to do with medical science, medical ethics, cloning, vaccinations, treatment of AIDS, and so on, part of the implications of living in the modern world. But also human rights issues have turned up on their agenda from time to time. I want to emphasize that the Fiqh Academy is an extremely distinguished body. I suppose for an American audience, the easiest analogy would be to say, imagine if the Chief Justices of all the states of Europe and the United States are met together. That's what the Fiqh Academy is like. Each nation has nominated their chief jurist or their most distinguished jurist to this body. So when they gather, they are all incredibly learned, very authoritative in their own countries, and working at highest possible level in Islamic law. Just some examples. Judge Muhammad Taqi Usmani was a Supreme Court judge in Pakistan for 20 years and has been involved in the Fiqh Academy since the beginning. He's now, I believe, he's the Vice President, very distinguished jurist. Sheikh Ali Goma is the Grand Mufti of Egypt, and the Grand Mufti of Oman, another example. So these are not lightweights. These are not extremists. They're not radicals. They are the best of the best in the area of Islamic jurisprudence from the Muslim world, gathering together regularly to talk about the hardest issues that are facing the Muslim world. They tend to pass resolutions on specific topics. Each topic could go through extensive preparation, research papers and distribution of papers, commentary, and then discussion in an open forum at the meetings. This process, to quote from one of the sites, allows for a Muslim to see the final opinion without having to use up time and effort considering the search consultations that may extend to hundreds of pages. So the resolutions, as is not uncommon with fatwas in Islam, are usually quite brief, not giving the reasons, but the guidance is clear. This is the answer to your question. And I think it's important to understand that the simplicity sometimes of the resolution shouldn't deceive you in misunderstanding that, in fact, a great deal thought and work, high-level work may have gone into coming up with those recommendations. Another thing about the Islamic Fiqh Academy is that it has the backing of the OIC, which is a very significant political group, perhaps one of the strongest blocs in the UN in the world today. And there's also the unique prestige of the Islamic Fiqh Academy members themselves. And these two factors together mean that its guidance has to be considered to have great authority. One can't afford to ignore what the Fiqh Academy is saying, even if it is saying it just in Arabic. The Fiqh Academy's role in the development of global Islamic finance is huge, I believe, and as I mentioned, its members are distinguished leading consultants to global financial institutions. So I think it's reasonable to say that the Fiqh Academy speaks for the Islamic mainstream. It's not a marginal voice, but it is, to refer to what the Secretary General of IFA said, it is the supreme juristic reference for the Muslim world. At least that is what it's sought to be, and it's been working to be that for 30 years. Now, I'd like to look at some resolutions and discussions that have taken place at the Fiqh Academy relating to human rights and responsibilities. In 2009, there was a session of IFA, and they made a number of resolutions. Three of particular interest is one on domestic violence, which I'm not going to speak about today, but is quite a fascinating resolution. Another on freedom of expression, and one on religious freedom. Other topics they considered at that session included Sharia banking, securities, diabetes and fasting. If you're a diabetic, can you fast? What are the conditions of that? Emergency medical operations, the environment. So responding to specific Islamic issues and also current issues that are important for Muslims in the world today. I will also address another set of rulings or of guidance, fatwas, that have a very interesting origin. In the early 1980s, Taha Jabir Alawani, who was the founder of the International Islamic Institute of Islamic Thought here in Washington, D.C., prepared 28 questions about the needs of Muslim minorities. And he wrote a letter to IFA mentioning the dangers of assimilation for the Islamic community and asked for answers to these 28 questions. In fact, it was on the first agenda of IFA when it was meeting at its second meeting and they began to make resolutions. It was tabled at that second session in 1985 and responses were reported in 1986 and they have been published in English together with about 15 years of resolutions. What was quite interesting about these 28 questions is although most of them were answered, the first two were not. There was no resolution in response to the first two questions, and I'll come back to what they were in a moment. But it concerns the status of Muslims living in non-Islamic societies. Now, I think it's reasonable and uncontroversial to point out that Muslims and indeed Islam itself are under pressure about human rights and responsibilities in the world today. There is a tension, it is said, between Sharia law and universal understandings of equality and freedom. That is really implied by the existence of the Cairo Declaration of Human Rights, which places the Sharia above all other concepts of human rights and is in a sense in contrast to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Some of the areas of concern are the rights of women, also religious freedom, both for non-Muslims living in an Islamic society and also Muslims who might have dissident views about Islam or non-orthodox views according to those that are in power. Freedom of speech is an issue. The treatment of non-Muslim minorities in Islamic states is an issue, that is their disabilities in law that they often experience. And also another issue is the free and equal participation of Muslim minorities in non-Islamic states. So the position of Muslims in European countries or in America, for example. The topics that are raised at IFA do reflect a request for guidance. They reflect some pressure, perhaps, in some cases, upon the Ummah to respond. Islam Abdulaziz, who is an Islam Online journalist, was present in the 2009 session, and he reported what he called hot debates on religious freedom, particularly on the apostasy penalty. Apparently, some of the foreign ministers of the OIC had asked that this be addressed by the Fiqh Academy. In Islam, the classical treatment of apostates, those that leave Islam, is death for men, and the schools of Islam vary on how women should be treated, ranging from death to life imprisonment or confinement. So this is an issue that's come up as something that the Muslim world is asking for guidance about from IFA. And the debate was very interesting, as reported by the journalist. Some of the representatives there said that we're only discussing this because of Western pressure, so we shouldn't be discussing it at all. Others said no, IFA's job is to respond to changing modern conditions, and the modern world is different from the way the world was a few centuries ago. And this is an issue that now has to be addressed because of the changing circumstances. So there was a debate about why this was being discussed at all. One of the commentators, one of the participants, said there's a difference for some Muslim leaders between their private views and what they say publicly. If they're pushed for a public statement, they'll affirm the traditional penalty of death for apostates, but in private they will express unease about it. I think it's not only Islam that has that sometimes tension between people's private views and the public official view. One of the contributors to the discussions pointed out that the apostasy law is not just about the death penalty, but also it also mandates the automatic dissolution of marriages when one of the parties leaves Islam, a loss of custody of children, loss of all inheritance rights, and various legal disabilities. In a number of states, people who leave Islam become legal non-persons. They have no right to represent themselves or to pursue their own interests before the law. It was also interesting that there was a desire in the debate about this issue to affirm the tradition, not to impugn or criticize the perfection of the Sharia. Dr. Hamdi Zakzoug said, reconsidering this issue, he was arguing that it should be reconsidered, does not mean whatsoever that we're calling for renouncing a firmly established principle of religion. Doing so would be out of the question. It would not even be subject to debate. And there was a dispute amongst the experts as to whether discussing the apostasy law was reconsidering a completely cut and dried, cast in stone principle of Islam, or whether it was in fact allowing a reconsideration of non-essential principles in the light of changing circumstances. The Salafis, a very conservative group who like to stay very close to the example of Muhammad and the teachings of the Quran, they objected to the discussion at all. There were discussions about whether the weight of the Quran as opposed to the hadiths, because it's the hadiths that make really clear the penalty of killing apostates. And if you have a Quran only or a stronger emphasis on the Quran, you might come to a different conclusion. So extremely interesting discussions. But the key assumption, which I think it remains unchallenged in this context, is that the Sharia itself is perfect, God-given, and the only valid universal framework for understanding human rights and responsibilities. This is the perspective that runs all the way through the Cairo Declaration of Human Rights. That's why it's stated at the end that the Sharia is the foundation, the source, and the ultimate arbiter of any issue to do with human rights. Let's have a look at the two rulings. The ruling on freedom of expression states that freedom of expression is a protected right in Islam within the context of Islamic legal restrictions. So people have freedom of expression, but not if Islam says they don't. And some of the restrictions that arise in Islam in relation to speech are that one should not offend others and their dignity. So hurting other people's feelings is a serious problem in Islamic law. It's also necessary to protect the interests, the stability, the security of society. The purpose of expression, the fatwa says, or the resolution says, must please Allah. And freedom of expression does not extend to any sort of attack on the religion. That is, it's common in Arabic to refer to Islam as the religion, its rules, rituals, and sanctities. So that's not part of freedom of expression, to criticize Islam or its prophet and its principles and so on. Also, freedom of expression must not lead to a break of the public order of the Ummah, the Islamic nation, and not create divisions among Muslims. So quite a lot of restrictions on freedom of expression. They call upon the states that are part of the OIC and Muslim governments everywhere, I suppose, to make use of available means to prevent the use of freedom of expression for insulting Islamic fundamentals and sanctities, or to sow fitna amongst Muslims. I think they're mentioning the word fitna is extremely interesting and important. Fitna in Arabic comes from a concept of trial or testing. And originally it meant persecution. But in the Islamic legal tradition, it comes to be extended to, some jurists would say, mean anything that undermines a Muslim's faith or leads them away from their faith. And there are some very severe warnings in the Quran against fitna. And one of the problems, for example, if someone leaves Islam, is this might make other Muslims insecure about their faith. It undermines confidence in Islam. So that is fitna. It's a kind of sedition if people leave Islam. So that was a very important term that was used there. They also call upon states to enforce restrictions made to prevent defamation of religions and their symbols, and to establish international legislation to protect feelings, that is, religious sentiments and religious sanctities, generally from being insulted, ridiculed, or maimed under the pretext of art, freedom of expression, or otherwise. Indeed, the OIC has been very active in the United Nations for years to set up a framework of laws that would prevent what is called defamation of religion. In essence, the heart of the matter which we see in these rulings is really the defamation or the criticism of Islam and insulting of the holy aspects of Islam. So they're very, from a Western perspective, these are very strict restrictions on freedom of expression. You're free to speak, but not to speak, in essence, against Islam. This International Fiqh Academy resolution endorses the Sharia view of freedom of speech. I mean, freedom of speech is not a term in Sharia law. It's a modern conception. But the response to the claim of freedom of speech or freedom of expression is very much expressed from a Sharia perspective in this resolution. I think it basically supports the anti-blasphemy laws, such as that of Pakistan, and works to prevent criticism of Islam. Another critical reflection is that there's a lack of reciprocity in outlook. There isn't a sense that different religions should treat each other in the same way. That sort of consideration is not part of the framework. There is a problem too from the most Western understandings of universality of human rights in protecting feelings. That is, usually people say persons should be protected, and in the common law tradition you can criticize someone if what you say is true. Defamation only applies if you say what's not true. But when you get into the area of protecting feelings, and prohibiting people being offended, it's very, very, very difficult to implement in a fair and equal way, because one person's insult might be someone else's true fact. And the introduction of laws to prohibit anyone causing offence creates, I think, many, many difficulties for human rights in the area of freedom of expression. The focus of this freedom of religion, moving on to freedom of religion. The other resolution was on freedom of religion. And the focus is actually very much on the apostasy issue, the freedom of people to leave Islam, and also to do things that might cause others to leave Islam, the right to reject Islam. It's not on freedom of religion in the sense of the rights of religious minorities. For example, many non-Muslim communities have legal disabilities in Islamic states. It's quite common to be very difficult to get permission to establish a church, for example, but usually much easier to build a mosque. So it's not focusing on those issues of religious freedom, that is the rights of religious minorities, but more on the apostasy issue. That's the one that's being pressed upon the Fiqh Academy. They say that there's an urgent need within the Islamic world for guidance on this issue. So it's obviously the issue of the apostasy law is having some traction at the very highest level of the Islamic theological and political community. It acknowledges the research and discussions, I think because there was so much disagreement and different views expressed. And it says that freedom of religion is limited by the standards of Islamic law. So basically it reverts to the standard Sharia position. There's also a sense of threat that the Ummah is experiencing. The Islamic nation feels under threat. It must be protected from the risks and ideas brought to us in all forms of religious or non-religious invasion, which aim to dissolve the Islamic identity of the Muslim nation. The idea of melting or dissolving the Islamic identity is a regular theme of discussions like this. This is the danger of integration and assimilation, the loss of the nationhood of Islam amongst Muslims. It does affirm the no compulsion in religion verse in the Quran, but when you look at the report of the discussion, this was interpreted very differently by the different participants. So some of the scholars said that no compulsion in religion should be the whole basis of evaluating a question like the apostasy laws. Others said no, that's not applicable to that at all. And they were following a more traditional interpretation of the verse. There is a call also in the midst of what's obviously a contentious issue for Muslims to be in unity, even when they disagree on doctrine and law, to excuse each other in matters of disagreement. One of the functions of the OIC and of IFA is to promote unity amongst Muslims, not to fracture the Ummah. There's also this threat of the doubt about Islam. It's necessary to put an end to the confusion which is arising concerning accepted and well-established Islamic understandings, and to allay doubts about what is required by the religion of the Islamic community, because this confusion poses a threat to the religion and the society. So there's this fatwa, this ruling is being produced in the context of a sense of being threatened by arising doubts and confusion in the Muslim community around the world. There's also, as part of this fatwa, an objection, I think, to non-Orthodox or non-Muslim witness. Perhaps missionary groups, it's not made clear. It's necessary to deter unacceptable methods which are transplanted by those who are claiming religious freedom. So what they're saying is people claim they're acting on the basis of freedom of religion, but really they're using unacceptable methods to promote their beliefs in the Muslim community. We have to protect society and its religious security. This idea of protecting the social order is a very central one in discussions of apostasy. Some of the presenters in the discussion said that the problem is not if someone leaves Islam, but when they publicly state that they have, or they become publicly known as someone who's rejected Islam. That damages society. It's a threat to the order, because others might follow that person. So the issue of the impact on the social order is really crucial, is the key test, they would say. They also try to strengthen the authorities of the state and of the religious authorities. The fatwa of apostasy, the ruling of apostasy or blasphemy, is to be issued by recognised scholars in conjunction with the assumption of power of the judicial authorities under conditions set by the jurists, so proper Islamic governance, such as offering repentance, so the apostate has to be offered an opportunity to come back to Islam, and the removal of suspicions, so basically checking things out during a grace period, sufficient to ensure that legitimate interests prevail. So they're shoring up the idea that you can't just take it on yourself to kill your apostate neighbour or son or whatever. That this should be done if there's a penalty applied, it should be done in a proper way. They say that apostasy law is quite compatible with religious freedom, but remember, it's the concept of religious freedom, for example, in the Cairo Declaration. The manifestation of apostasy poses a threat to the unity of the Muslim community, the Ummah, and to the doctrine of Muslims, and encourages non-Muslims or hypocrites to use it to cast doubts, that is, on Islam. He who commits it deserves the application of punishment applied by the judiciary, that is death. They don't say that, but that's the subtext really, and not any other party. So non-state or people that don't have the proper authority shouldn't take it upon themselves to kill, for example, the governor of Punjab in Pakistan. That would be an act that this ruling would prohibit, and to prevent danger and to protect society and its security. So there's a concern for the social order. This rule is not incompatible with religious freedom. So that's quite important to understand. From the perspective of these jurists, to put someone to death for leaving Islam, if it's done properly, is not in any way inconsistent with religious freedom. Because Islam guarantees religious freedom for those who respect religious feelings and values of society and public order. So the implication, I think, is that if you left Islam, you would respect the order and religious feelings of the society and maybe keep it completely private. That's one possible way of reading that. There's a fear for a disordered society, a kind of apostophobia. Muslim rulers should provide for the needs of members of society, including the responsible use of freedom and the provision of food, housing, treatment, education, employment opportunities and other needs. So they're asking governments to govern properly. Why is this related to religious freedom? Well, it strengthens the new generation against mind-altering seductive influences and materials used to promote anti-Islamic values. So in the context of concern about people leaving Islam, if governments establish stable and effective societies, people will be more confident in their Islam and less likely to want to leave it, or less vulnerable to being led astray by people using these unwanted methods coming in from outside. This resolution also basically endorses the conservative view, even though it was controversial amongst the members, without actually spelling it out. It's interesting that it speaks of the manifestation of apostasy, so the public demonstration of your apostasy is of the greatest concern. Nagla al-Imam in Egypt, she really began to get into trouble with the authorities when she was broadcasting. She's now a Christian lawyer, but she's left a human rights lawyer. She's left Islam and is in hiding there. And she was told that if she stayed in her house, basically under permanent confinement, she'd be okay. But by speaking out, by broadcasting and letting her voice be known or going in public, that would cause an offence to the public order. So that's when her safety became an issue. There's an emphasis also on proper legal authorities and due process. So these rulings support traditional Sharia restrictions. There are reformers at the highest levels, but they're far from carrying the field. The official religious position of global Islam remains unchanged despite the pressure of modern conditions. There is little or no engagement with the issue of concern to people in the West of reciprocity between faiths, that is, the freedom to convert to Islam in the West and the treatment of converts in non-Islamic states. There's no awareness that that might be a related issue. I'd like to just conclude by touching on a few issues to do with citizenship. In the early 1980s, they had all these questions that came from Washington about what does it mean to live as a Muslim in the United States or in Europe. And they answered most of the questions, but not the first question, which was, is it legal for a Muslim to become a naturalized citizen of the United States? They avoided that, but they did publicize in Arabic various opinions that had been submitted to them by their experts. And they were available on the internet until a few years ago, but I've been watching it for a while, so I downloaded them. The scholars' views are essentially this, that non-Muslim citizenship is only allowed if the Muslim is unsafe in their homeland or if they're there to proselytize to spread Islam, but not if the goal is purely economic. And they vary as to the degree of sin that's involved if you emigrate and become an American citizen or a British citizen for economic reasons. The fundamental duty is to live in the house of Islam, if you can. And they mentioned fatwas that from the colonial period. There were a whole series of fatwas that said that it was unlawful for a Muslim, for example, in India to become a British citizen. And also they mentioned the legal tradition in Andalusia, where there were Muslims living under or in cooperation with Christians. A very long memory. This is not a new issue, but it's become a huge issue, of course, because of the vastness of Islamic immigration in modern times. Muhammad Taqi Usmani, who is the very distinguished scholar from Pakistan, said that naturalization is prohibited if it leads to being proud of the new nation, preferring it to Muslim nationality, or to resembling the people of the new nation in daily life. This is a quite important concern that comes up again and again. You're not meant to look like or act like non-Muslims. The Mufti of Tunisia spoke at length about the social contract and understanding of citizenship in Western terms, sophisticated analysis. And he said all the essentials of naturalization, the understanding of citizenship that's part of Western societies, which we've brought forth, are an absolute rejection of the rules of Islam and a seeking of the ruling other than Allah's ruling. That means you're giving authority to democracy or to people, not to Allah, in your life if you submit to this citizenship. They also were concerned about the risk that if you became a citizen, you might be asked to fight against Muslims. So these are quite strong rulings, really, at the time in the early 1980s, mid-1980s. I must acknowledge that in the 25 years since then, the jurisprudence for non-Muslims living in Muslims living in non-Islamic states has developed enormously, and there are much more sophisticated and kind of nuanced positions now. So the Islamic jurisprudence for minorities continues to evolve. The classical view, which was that you weren't allowed to live in the lands of infidelity for more than 4 nights, no longer holds unquestioned sway. I mean, it can't, pragmatically, it doesn't work. But there still remain quite a diversity of views, and as yet, the Fiqh Academy is not willing to put a view down in writing on it. There continues to be strong religious backing at the highest levels for rejecting non-Muslim identity after migration, so an opposition to integration or assimilation, seeing citizenship as a competing, not a complementary identity, seeing assimilation as a threat. I want to mention a question, or just quote a question that Montgomery Watt raised in 1993. Does the Sharia allow Muslims to live peaceably with non-Muslims in the one world? The efforts of the International Fiqh Academy, its fatwas and the advice that it's received, suggest there are difficulties here, both in the lands of Islam and also in the lands of migration. In the House of Islam, non-Muslims and dissidents' freedoms are to be limited, while in the House of the infidels, or the non-Muslims, there is a tension between the conflicting calls upon their loyalty of the two nations, the nation of Islam and the country in which they're living. This tension derives in part from within Islam itself. It's a tension that exists within Islamic law. One of the great advantages of these rulings and the discussions that have been taking place in the Fiqh Academy is, as I said, and I want to stress again, these are not marginal or extreme statements, but they're the reflections of highly capable, very gifted and well-trained, highly respected individuals whose word has authority in the Islamic world. And it gives us really a window into an ongoing discourse or discussion, debate that's happening in the Islamic world, and also, I think, a heads up for considering the question of what is Islam and how is it developing and how will it shape and influence the sense of identity of Muslims in the world. These are also important rulings for those who are concerned with the status of non-Muslim minorities in Islamic states and the sentiments that are being expressed by leading religious figures about the issue of freedom of religion and freedom of expression. I think I'm going to stop there.
Well, thank you very much for your really penetrating reporting and analysis on the Islamic Fiqh Academy, which most of us really are not aware of in any kind of detail. I'm sure there are lots of questions, and I thought maybe we could turn to that. If you want to continue standing, that might be
Thank you.
Good. Okay. Why don't we go in the back of the room? Is that Hillel? Is that Hillel Fratkin? And just to identify yourself. So it's Hillel Fratkin from Hudson.
Hillel Fratkin of the Center on Islam at Hudson. Thank you for that. Was a very impressive and interesting talk, as Nina just said, about a subject that isn't particularly well known. I wanted to ask a couple of questions about process. As you know, most fatwas would be in the ordinary course of things solicited by an individual, directed to an individual faqih or jurisprudent, living in the country where they're living. How are I wanted to ask, how are the questions generated for these rulings? And what you might say has been, if you can, the dynamic of how that's developed over time. The second thing is, how do you imply that there could be an issue arising, as one would expect, given the fact that there are 4 orthodox schools of law for Sunnis, not to mention the Jafari school for Shia. And I wondered how they handle that when they issue a ruling.
I think the questions come to the Academy in a variety of ways. Sometimes it's an individual or an organisation, like the body in Washington that sent the letter, and sometimes it's the ministers of the Islamic of the member states, the foreign ministers that meet annually that could raise issues. So they come in a number of ways. Many of the finance issues will arise out of the work of the members of the Fiqh Academy giving advice to financial institutions. So they are definitely giving advice in response to questions that are asked of them, as you rightly pointed out, but not individuals. Usually they're organisations or countries. And in some cases, like the freedom of religion, freedom of expression issue, they also have a sense that this is a very pressing topic for them. And they really need to give some guidance, because there's a fear that if they don't speak, if they're just silent, there'll be a kind of chaotic diversification of views, and the Muslim community will be not as unified. The issue of different schools in Islamic law, I think many of the issues that that IFA is ruling on are not ones that the different schools would be fighting over. For example, the whole area of modern finance is a new area, and they've really been working at that and trying to work together on it. So I'm not certain, I haven't researched that question specifically, but I believe that many of these issues would not actually be boiled down to differences between different schools of Sunni jurisprudence, let alone differences between Shiite and Sunni views. Clearly there are some Shiite representatives there, and the Sunnis are a dominant group, and I've had no sense that there's a conflict. If there was, I just don't know enough about it. But the purpose of this body is to manifest and create unity. So they'd be working quite hard to avoid those sort of fractious issues that might split them apart.
I also wanted to ask, I wasn't quite clear which two questions remain unanswered.
Thank you. The first question is it lawful for a Muslim to become a naturalized citizen? It was a long question, actually, given that they have fled their homeland because of persecution. And they've come to America, most of them say, because they weren't safe to practice their religion, and they're safe to practice it in America. Is it lawful? The second question related to the bringing up of children in a non-Islamic environment. What guidance could be given to the problem of raising a child as a member of the Islamic nation in a non-Islamic society? But the first question was really the big one, but the second was a sort of a addendum to that part of that same question. I should say some of the other 28 questions were quite simple, like, is it lawful for a Muslim woman to shake the hand of a man? And the answer was no, it's not. Is it lawful for a woman to wear makeup or pluck her eyebrows? Yes, it's lawful to wear makeup, but not to pluck your eyebrows. So many of the questions were highly specific and very easy to answer. Another one was, is it permissible if you hope a non-Muslim will convert to Islam, a man, for a woman to marry him on the hope that he'll become a Muslim? The answer is no, that's not permissible. So most of the questions were kind of very straightforward.
Cliff, wait just for the microphone. Because we're recording it.
Cliff May Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Implicit, but I want to make sure this is clear. If a Muslim cannot emigrate to the house of the infidels for economic reasons, I assume, but I want to check, it would also be impermissible for a Muslim in good standing to emigrate to the house of the infidels for greater freedom, for example, for other things that a country like the United States might offer.
Before I answer that, I want to say that the jurists that responded had a diversity of views about that. One person said it's apostasy to migrate for the reason of economic advantage. Another said, well, it's not good, but it's not that bad. You know, it's a bad thing. But the question of emigrating for the purpose of freedom, that would be worse, because you're coming because you like the non-Muslims. However, there's another way of turning it around. So some Muslim jurists have said, actually, America is a really Islamic society because I can practice my faith here much better than where I was in the Middle East or somewhere else. So I've come here because I want to practice Islam more freely. So there's this debate that goes on about the implications of freedom. If your desire is to copy the ways of non-Muslims and their ideology and their way of life, that would be wrong and unacceptable. Did I answer both your questions?
Actually, the second part of the question I hadn't asked yet, but it's sort of related. When you use the phrase, and I know you're being careful in your language, little engagement with the issue of reciprocity.
Yes.
Would you consider it unfair if somebody were to say what that really means is they have a view in that Islam is above and not to be seen as the equal of other religions, and therefore there cannot be the same respect for other religions that other religions are to give to Islam?
Look, it's very difficult because words mean different things to different people. So the Muslim scholars would say that they do give respect to other religions, but undoubtedly the classical view is that Islam rules, it's never ruled. And there's a verse in the Quran that says that Muhammad was sent to make Islam triumphant or preeminent above other religions. So the worldview of supremacy of Islam is an underlying kind of assumption or premise that informs many of these discussions. It is, however, extremely difficult to engage in dialogue because the words mean different things. So the scholars, the IFA scholars, they define freedom of religion quite differently, as I've shown. They don't see putting someone to death for leaving the faith as a problem for freedom of religion. So the terms mean different things. The word respect means different things. So respect for Christians might mean a different thing from respect for Muslims. And the desire to establish a kind of a discussion about the problems of reciprocity is a kind of a pressing issue in the world today. And it'll come up more and more, but it's something really worth focusing on. No, I think the traditional Islamic view is that Islam is superior, and one of the roles of Sharia is to manifest that superiority in political and social conditions.
This gentleman here.
Adam Savitt, Center for Security Policy. The organs of the OIC I'm familiar with, the Islamic Development Bank, IDB, the financial arm, Islamophobia Observatory, the monitors speech in the West, are basically subservient to the Secretary General's office or political directives. Thank you for enlightening us on the IFA. It seems to me, because of the religious character, it could actually drive policy rather than taking direction from the Secretary General. So if you could speak to basically the bureaucratic relationship, and is the IFA a rubber stamp for the Secretary General?
Not at all.
Okay, so
you can't get a group of people of this seniority and influence in Islamic jurisprudence and tell them to just come out with things that are against their conscience. They will not do it.
okay.
Look, it is a very complicated relationship between religious authorities and the state, because in many countries it's the government or the ruler that appoints the Grand Mufti. This is an age-old issue in Islam, the tension between religious authority and political authority. But so all these individuals at this level would be sensitive to political implications. That's the nature of their position and the fact that they're functioning in leadership in an environment where Islam and politics are integrated. There's no difference between religion and politics in the Islamic tradition. But it would certainly be wrong to regard IFA as rubber stamping anything. Quite the contrary, they will drive policy, and they would speak, I think, with a voice of integrity on the issues that you have to assume that they're speaking what they really believe, and they believe to be the case. Although remembering that there is this pressure when you make a public statement to give a more traditionalist Sharia a compliant view rather than to express doubts. In fact, if you broadcast doubts from the platform of the IFA, you undermine the Ummah, So it's not their job to say, well, I'm a senior Muslim cleric and I have some doubts about the apostasy law. That's not what the Fiqh Academy is going to do. They will tend to have a conservative bias in reinforcing traditional understandings. But they are obviously working on new issues all the time, so there's a tension there inherent in their work. That's really their bread and butter. They're experts at managing that and trying to find their way through with it.
Also, if I could interject, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that about a third of the member states of the OIC are not even Muslim majority states,
That's right.
nor are they Islamic states. And Paul Marshall's written about this in the article that you have on your chair. And some of these states, when the summit was held in 2005 in Mecca, the heads of states could not even attend the meeting in person. So certainly this body would not prevail in any dispute over Islam over the IFA. That would prevail. The IFA would be. For that reason alone, it would.
Yes.
The body would be subordinate in a way to its subsidiary body, which is an anomaly. But
Nina's point was that it's not possible for a non-Muslim to go to Mecca. So if they hold a meeting of heads of states in Mecca, those heads of states that aren't Muslims can't attend. But yes, quite a number of the states in the OIC are not majority Islamic states. They might have secular constitutions. They've joined for lots of reasons. There might be economic and political advantages to be part of the OIC. There's many aspects to the OIC's work. I think the last comment is the question is very true. The International Fiqh Academy is a very important body that has they would drive a theological policy, and because the members of that academy are themselves leaders in their own countries, they have authority to command a following in their own countries, they have a capacity to back up what IFA does and to promote the views that they've been part of forming to their own constituencies as well.
Okay, back there, is that Doug? Is that you? Yeah.
Doug Fife, Senior Fellow here at the Hudson Institute. Thank you very much for that presentation. Did the Fiqh Academy address issues coming out of the 9/11 attack? Have they addressed questions about jihad and the kinds of things that are, particular national security interest to
They
the
may
United
have
States and
done
other countries?
they may have done a few rulings on that, but it's not been one of their major focuses. Interestingly, they made a statement recently deploring the massacre of Christians in Egypt on New Year's Eve. So that was quite striking that they felt the need to do that. The Secretariat responded. So they rejected that violence. Their view, I haven't studied that particular issue, but it's not their major concern. That's not their major concern.
Okay, over here. We'll go from the back.
Hi, Jerome Sokolovsky with Voice of America. I'm just curious if you have a sense of how influential these rulings are on local imams in non-member states.
That's a very good question, and I don't know the answer to it. If they are influential, it'll be because the members of the Fiqh Academy are themselves influential in their own countries. But the local imams probably have their own texts and their own training that they fall back on. But you need to understand the Islamic world is incredibly diverse, and people are working at emerging issues in Islamic jurisprudence that are changing. And the local imam is not equipped to deal with new issues that are coming up. And so they might be very influenced in some areas. For example, if you're running an aid project in a sub-Saharan country, working on helping diabetics, you will be interacting with the IFA ruling. It will influence the way the project is set up. And if the OIC is involved in medical science developments and supporting developments, they will be taking guidance in terms of that. So it will depend a bit, therefore, on the topic. If you're looking at an issue like apostasy law, obviously local Muslims will have very strong views about that one way or another, and they might not be so influenced by a fairly carefully worded statement from IFA. But if you're looking at, say, genetic engineering or issues to do with Islamic finance, they might be very much strongly guided by it. But I haven't studied the implementation process and impact of those fatwas.
Okay, in the middle. On this side.
Hi, Courtney Rad with Freedom House. The OIC announced a couple years back that it was creating a new Human Rights Commission, and I'm wondering what role IFA might play in that, or if any, and if you have any.
Yeah, I can't comment. I mean, IFA's role is to give an Islamic view. So they will give a theological statement. And I'd expect that, I can only guess that a human rights organization, its primary function would be to lobby at the UN and in other places to pursue Islamic human rights concerns. And they'd be influenced by the guidance provided by IFA, but they would not be under IFA. It would be like the guidance is out there and they'd have to consider it. But so that would be, there's lots of interesting questions that arise about the role of the Islamic Fiqh Academy, and unfortunately I can't answer them all.
Sarah Stern, Endowment for Middle East Truth. First of all, I want to thank you because this was a very sensitive handling of a topic, and it's obvious that you've studied it from within. I'm wondering, looking at the demographic numbers in Europe and in certain parts of the United States, and you see many conservative Muslims, distilling everything that you've said, do you feel that most of the reason for migration here among conservative Muslims is dawah to Islam, since it doesn't seem to be appropriate to just come here to make a living?
Well, the question that came from the International Institute of Islamic Thought in Washington said that Muslims in America say their main reason for emigrating is persecution in their countries. So they're fleeing a bad situation. And it is the case, for example, that Britain has collected a lot of radicals from the Middle East. And that's one of the problems they're facing in managing a kind of rapidly emerging demographic issue, that they've, as it were, attracted the people that would be most sat upon by their own governments for their Islamic radicalism. And another reason is dawah. I don't know I don't know quite the answer to that. I have met Muslims and heard of Muslims who say, yes, I'm here to promote Islam. There's no question about that. And even if you weren't, even if you came for economic reasons, if you adopted that reason as your story, that would be a good thing to do. Like, even if you're here to make a living, if you then have a strong religious activism that, in a sense, blesses, it makes righteous your presence. So there's the existence of this kind of legal opinion gives a strong incentive for ordinary Muslims to own the dawah cause, to say, I am an agent for proclaiming my faith. Otherwise, they have doubts about whether they're actually committing a sin and living in the lands of migration. I must say that the jurisprudence for immigration or the lands, the Muslims in a minority situation has rapidly evolved in 25 years. So now there are attempts to develop more understandings of a kind of a social contract that's not in conflict with Islam. But what you'll find is a fragmenting of views about how to respond to that. The most difficult problem long-term for harmony in non-Islamic states is the emergence of a Sharia-compliant society within the state. So multiplication of Sharia courts up and down the UK, where a woman will not be able to have her divorce recognised by the Muslim community unless it's done by a Sharia court. And that means that her rights at law are determined by the Sharia, not by the common law of England. So you get two classes of women in the UK, those who have the rights of common law and those who have the rights of Sharia. And I must say that the pressure not to be like or to imitate the infidels or to like their ways or to submit to their ways is quite strong and felt at a local level by many Muslims in the West. They need to keep themselves separate. And but these rulings by religious leaders have a kind of very high level influence on the grassroots view of that problem. But there's no doubt that the guidance that is produced by Islamic leaders will have an influence in shaping how Muslim minorities will respond to this issue of how they exist. Now, obviously, the classic view that you could only stay for 4 nights is not workable anymore. And we're going through a very, very interesting time of change and readjustment.
On this side and then in the back.
Thank you. Here at Hudson as well. I mean, it seems like this issue of migration is one where the Academy couldn't really have had a lot of influence on what actually happened. I mean, if you look at Western Europe especially, I mean, you mentioned the case of people who came to England because they actually were persecuted in their homes. But if you look at, the vast majority of Muslims in Western Europe, it seems evident they came for economic opportunity. Certainly the Turks were invited in as guest workers. What is that? Economic. So I'm just wondering, what does that say about this question of overall influence of the rulings of this group on the Islamic world as a whole, given that you said that it's very diverse. There hasn't traditionally been a single authority of the Muslim world. Various schools of law among the Sunni, Sunni and Shia. So this is, in some sense, a new development, is it not? That
it is.
Have a pan-Islamic legal system, and I just wonder how one gets a feel for how effective this is.
Yes. I think I see those opinions from scholars as a litmus test. As a sort of a litmus test of what religious authorities in Islam, serious ones, are saying about this issue. So it represents not just the 6 or 7 voices that have been collected by IFA, but actually thousands of people. And within Islamic tradition, in Islamic law, the view about not imitating non-believers and not seeking to like their ways, rejecting having them as your guardians or relying on them for your protection, that's not disputed. That's a very strongly held value. Muhammad said that migration for reasons of persecution is no longer valid after a certain point in his career. You have to go where there are Muslims and be part of the Muslim community in a position of dominance. So these are not marginal views; they're quite deeply held. But these fatwas are quite important for understanding the challenge that the Muslim minorities will face in re-theologizing their experience. The British found themselves, the Queen of England found herself ruling a third of the world's Muslims. It's not a new problem. And the way she resolved that was to get a fatwa from Turkey, from the Caliphate, to say that the British Empire was Dar al-Islam, the House of Islam. And the particular form of jurisprudence that applied in Turkey was more susceptible or open to that ruling. That is, if you had a ruler who might not be a Muslim, but was righteous and allowed Muslims to follow their legal requirements, then they could consider that the land they were in was Islam, and that allowed, in a sense, the Muslims of India to stay put. So you'll see Islamic leaders in America saying this is an Islamic country because we are freer to practice Islam. Now, what they're really doing when they're saying that, they're not just saying how much they like being here. They're saying we have permission to stay here because we're not living in the lands of infidelity. So these rulings are important because they give you a framework for understanding how that sense of identity is evolving and the basis of it. Also, there could be changes. For example, if the society began to actively suppress or discriminate against particular manifestations of Islam, such as allowed Sharia courts and then start banning them, that could in fact cause a reversion of the situation where the Islamic community finds itself to be in the house of infidelity again. And so you've got long-term policy issues about how to, in a sense, manage the sense of identity of Muslims living in a non-Islamic environment. They're very sensitive issues, and they'll continue to evolve and change in the years ahead.
I wanted to ask a follow-up related question to this. Hillel Fradkin again. You mentioned, of course, that there's a great preoccupation with unity in Muslim law and also in the expressions of this body, and a great preoccupation with its opposite, fitna or sedition or disunity. And that's a very, very old preoccupation, but it stems partly from the fact that there was a great split early on, and there remain many splits. Including having to do with things like respecting one another's feelings. I mean, there's an old tradition of Sunnis and Shias insulting one another in rather powerful terms. So I was wondering, when they all get together in Jeddah or where they happen to be, how they handle the considerable, they may all have the ambition to see a united ummah and a unified perhaps unified world, but there's a certain tendency for them to approach it on their grounds, so to say it should be united on the grounds of my perspective of what Islam is. So what's your sense of how they handle that? Because there are and remain very powerful disagreements among themselves.
Yes, I really can't comment. You're in the area of kind of individual psychology and personal experience, which I don't have access to. My belief is that the impetus to unity is a theological requirement that's really hardwired into the Quran. It's not a result of kind of later political developments. It's very clearly in the Quran this call to be one. I suspect also that the people that end up on the Ifa are people who themselves, by virtue of their preeminence in their country, have to be a focal point for unity. The very divisive figures don't get to the point where they're being appointed by their governments to go to this body. So, you'll be getting people who are used to being in situations where they're having to be careful about what they say and maybe not revealing all of their agenda, but working on the issues that are before them. The other thing about it is that there is this sense of great threat and challenge to the Muslim world. The urgency of promoting and establishing an Islamic identity at a global level. So the challenge is great. So that unites people, even though people have differences, they're united around a sense of the threat or challenge. And there's also great opportunities. If someone invites you as a leading jurist from your country to be part of this conversation, even if you disagree with some of the people there. Most people would want to be part of that. It would be helpful for them and increase their prestige, and be a great opportunity to be part of a historic process of theological development. So I think there are lots of incentives for people who themselves have already been filtered by a huge process of selection and advancement in their careers. There are many strong incentives for them to not to be too confrontational, but to work together. Nevertheless, the reporter's comments about the discussions about freedom of expression and religion suggested that there were some uncompromising brothers amongst the group who were very quick to say we shouldn't even be discussing this at all because it's just Western pressure that's bringing it to our agenda. So that's interesting that they do accommodate within their community a variety of views.
We are unfortunately out of time. I'm going to use my prerogative, though, to ask one last quick question. I can't help but ignore the fact that this academy, like the OIC itself, are located in Saudi Arabia. Is there pressure coming from Saudi Arabia? Is there a first among equals among the Fiqh Academy jurists, or do they all have equal say? Have you been able to detect whether there is a heavyweight among them who tends to influence? I mean, it seems to me that these are fairly, as you pointed out, traditional or fundamentalist conclusions to some of these issues, and that they haven't, at least in these areas, haven't much been modernized.
I don't think the heavyweights are necessarily Saudi scholars. Muhammad Taqi Usmani is a prominent Pakistani, and the Pakistani theologians have had a huge influence in modern times. So people, I would expect, would rise according to their gifts and also their access to the processes of power. There's no doubt, of course, that the Saudis have put a huge investment into the OIC. Each country contributes according to its capacity, and so there'd be some financial leverage. I believe the Muslim World League, which is based in Saudi Arabia, was also part of the founding and development of these initiatives. So there's a history to it, but I really can't comment with authority about the politics of who's in the preeminent positions and how they rise. I noticed that there are some nations that don't have representatives. It's possible. I'd be interested to know why. It's possible that to actually find someone with who can command the respect of the knowledge of Islamic law and also the fluency in modern Arabic, standard Arabic, to be part of that conversation is quite a high barrier in some countries. It's also, I find very interesting about this group is that they are, of all the many organs of the OIC, perhaps the most Arabic focused group, and that's one reason why people are not looking at them. And they're very well worth the study. Everyone's saying, well, who speaks for Muslims? Isn't there all this diversity? Actually, at the highest levels of jurisprudence, there's a remarkable uniformity, not diversity. And that uniformity reflects a consensus in traditional Sharia, and also, I think, a uniformity of will to engage with the challenges of the modern world in a way that draws Muslims together and doesn't push them apart.
Mark, thank you so much for your presentation today, and please also convey our condolences to all the victims of the floods in Brisbane.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.